Hey guys, I want to do a video real quick on John 4 as well. We've just finished up John 3. And in John 3, we realize that the great verse of calling to belief so that we have eternal life, John 3:16, for God so loved. And we could have probably spent a whole other video on just the phrase God loved. It's his love that motivated all these things. But we discussed what belief was related to obedience and to light and to darkness and these things. And then we shift to John 4. And what it says here is, now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria, so he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well, and it was about the 6th hour. Okay, I want to highlight some things here. Jesus is going into Samaria. And Jesus is about to sit down at a well at the 6th hour of the day, which would have been when the heat was coming. He's wearied. He's tired. He's avoiding the drama that the Pharisees are trying to cause between him and John the Baptist. He's walking in the meekness that we understand of the Lord, and he goes through Samaria. Now, here's what you need to know. Some of you probably know this, but some of you may not. Samaria at that time would have been similar to how the white and black relations in the South were, in the 1800s. Not to the degree of slavery, but to an absolute disdain that blacks and whites had for each other, and even the racial tension that came throughout some of the earlier parts of the 20th century, even through the civil rights movement, and even some carrying over even to today. Samaria and Judah, or what would have been Israel at that time, the southern tribes of Israel, had the same dealings. And people that lived in Samaria, what they were is they were the remaining people that were left after the Assyrian captivity. When Assyria came and took the northern kingdoms, some were left behind and they married other tribes from different nations. And they intermixed. They became what we call half-breeds, in the sense of that's what the language would have been used for them. And so when the South came back from their own captivity, which was in Babylon, they came back and they had a pure sense of we won't out. They didn't marry out. They stayed within. Israel tried to stay within its own nucleus there of the southern tribes, particularly Judah being the leading tribe there. They tried to stay that way. And so when they came back, they looked down on the Samaritans because they had not kept their Jewish identity intact. They had not honored God the way that Judah had, or the way they thought they should have. And so there's legitimate disdain. It's racially motivated because there's a mixing of culture and ethnicity from the other tribes that are not a part of Israel, from local nations in that area or other smaller nations around. There's also a dynamic of spiritual judgment because they're in Jerusalem. It's the head of all things, and so they have this notion of themselves that is better than. And Jesus is now in Samaria, where people normally, they would walk around Samaria rather than go through it. He's there at a well, and a woman shows up. Now, if you read through the story, you realize when he asks her for a drink, she's startled that a man, and particularly a Jewish man, would speak to her, particularly at the middle of the day at the well. Now, why? Generally, scholars will say that you wouldn't be at the well at the middle of the day unless you were someone that was looked down on by the culture. People didn't go draw water in the heat of the day. They did it in the morning. You go out early and get your water. But if you were a woman, let's say, that had been with 5 different men and were now with another one, and you had a reputation, then you wouldn't go in the morning because you wouldn't want to be shamed or ridiculed by the townspeople. You'd go during the heat of the day. And so there is this woman and there is Jesus. So Jesus is engaged in a conversation with her. And right in that moment, he's taking on racism. Right in that moment, he's taking on sexism. Right in that moment, he's taking on cultural issues that are rampant in society. And he doesn't just meet her there. He has a conversation where he does something for her that he didn't do for Nicodemus. The conversation shifts. He begins to talk about water that's inside of him that will spring up to life and to eternal life. She asks for this water. He tells her to get her husband. She says, I'm not married. He says, you tell the truth. The man you're with is not your husband. You've had 5 prior. And she's amazed. She goes, I perceive you're a prophet. Well, why does she perceive he's a prophet? Well, because he's told her the things that she's done, and he couldn't have known that. She's never met him. And so at this point, she begins to then shift the discussion into where people will worship, on what mountain. Jesus responds to her and says, the Father is looking, and a time is coming where we will look for those that worship in spirit and in truth. And he shifts it, and she says, I know these things will come about. I know these things will be established when the Messiah comes, right? When he comes. And so watch what Jesus says to her. It's down here. The woman said to him in verse 25, I know that Messiah is coming. He who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Now remember, with Nicodemus, you've got to be born of a woman. I speak of you of natural things you don't understand. This woman's posture and faith is to say, I know when the Messiah comes, he's going to tell us what mountains and what things and what's appropriate. And her posture, even as a broken woman at a well, there's something in her. There's a remnant of faith. There's a seed in her that is not coming with speculation, not coming with doubt, not coming in the night and ashamed, but in the midst of her own shame, in the middle of the heat of the day, she encounters Jesus, and she says, I know that there's a day coming that a Messiah is going to come. I know you're a prophet, but out of that discussion with a prophet, I know the greater thing is a Messiah is coming. When she says that, Jesus is like, yeah, I'm the one you're looking for. She runs back to her city. She tells them about this man that has told her all that she's done. She draws them back out to Jesus. At the same time, the disciples are starting to show up. They're confused. They've come, what's going on? They don't even ask Jesus, but they're confused. It's the middle of the day. You're with this woman. Furthermore, you must be hungry. And he says to them, listen, I have food to eat. My Father's work is my food to eat. And there's a harvest now that is plentiful. I don't have time for natural food. Why? Because we're about to encounter the city in Samaria, and we're going to draw them to me. And so and since my goal is to draw them to the Father through me, I'm not concerned about natural food. I'm concerned about the Father's portion in their lives. And so this woman brings them out, and all of this is going on. And Jesus begins to share with them. And by the end of it, they say to the woman, listen, we came because of what you said, but now we believe because of what we have heard and seen ourselves. I want you to realize something. Jesus chose the unlikeliest person to be his messenger. A broken woman, a Samaritan, someone with loose morals who'd been around, was known in town, was known by some of the men. And this isn't the leader of a youth group. This isn't, the next president. This isn't someone with great grades and, a whole life laid out for him. This is someone that's had it rough, and they've messed up, and they've fallen, and they're scarred, and they're broken, and they're there at the wrong time to be at the well, but because Jesus is there, it's the right time. And out of that encounter, in the midst of everything going wrong, God sees her, God changes her, and allows her to become a voice to her own people. Maybe the mess up that you're looking at that you think is so big isn't as important as you think. Maybe you just need to let God talk to you about who you really are. Maybe you need to take the mask off and let him just see the scars and the fears and the doubts and the struggles so that he can speak life to you, and so that you can realize he's never been afraid of your frailty. Anyhow, I love this story because it shows our Jesus taking on racism, sexism, using a woman as the first evangelist in the New Testament, who later is sainted and seen, called by the early church as one equal to the apostles. Fatima. Later, she's thrown into a well. They say her and her sons, and think of the irony there. The people that are martyring her are going to martyr her by putting her into the well, because that's where she keeps telling everyone she met Jesus. Anyhow, don't let the curves in your story stop you from believing God can meet you in the unlikeliest of places, maybe even at home right now in quarantine. All right, guys. Have a great day. God bless.